introduction. So as Samar said, I'm Waqar Salim. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Habib University, which is a small, relatively new liberal arts university in Pakistan. I got into computer science because of my interest in games. Like many computer science people will tell you, I'm that cliched computer scientist who played games as a kid and then thought that's cool, and then took it all the way to the PhD. My PhD, unlike some of you here, my PhD is not in games or related to games. It's in computer graphics. I thought that would lead to games, but it led to certain other mathematical directions, which was also cool. But I'm happy to talk to each of you here. You are more directly related to games. This panel here is, of course, about the future of education and the role that games will play in the future of education. That's something that I'm very interested in. I've done some experiments of my own, which I'll talk about as the conversation proceeds. But we'll start with Gianna. Gianna is the founder of Sakura Games with her sister, and I believe your sister was part of some other panel in this conference. But Gianna, can you tell us about yourself?
Thank you for having me. My name is Jana Alabdur. I'm 15 years old, and I'm co-founder of Sakura Games, where we create edutainment games to make education more interactive and fun, because we believe that education should be fun and kids should like to go to school, but that's not the case, unfortunately, right now. Although I think in some countries it is, like maybe with you, Ollie. I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry. What was the question?
Yeah, I was just asking about education in Finland.
Well, I suppose that in Finland the education system is naturally, it's quite well known because of the PISA results that we have achieved here during the past 20 or something years. I think that the main characteristics in Finnish education system is that all schools here are public, and the education is free. There are no tuition fees for anyone, not even if you study at the university. And then another characteristic is that there is a lot of autonomy for the schools and the teachers to decide how to teach and what kind of learning materials to use. And therefore, quite many teachers are gamifying the learning in the classrooms and also using educational games and games in general as part of their teaching practices.
Thanks, Ollie. So I'm a parent of 2 children, 8 and 6, who are school going. And then whenever I look up innovations in the educational space, so you mentioned PISA scores, of course, Finland comes up. There people make documentaries about the school system in Finland. I've watched some of those. So Finland is very, very inspiring that way. But I thought part of that was taking kids away from screens. And I think we are now talking about bringing them back to screens. So we'll come back to that. But I'll go over to Paul. Paul has had a very interesting career. I was going over his LinkedIn. He's been a writer. He's been involved in film. He's been a presenter. He's been a speaker. He's now an educator at University of Toronto. And along with all that, he's also a game designer, which brings him to this panel here. So Paul, you want to tell us about what you're doing at Goldbug Interactive and University of Toronto?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, by the way. That was very kind of you. So my life mission is to make schools better. That really is the fundamental thing that I've set out to do. And one thing that I found is that what games offer are systems to think about education differently. Education is a system. Schools are systems that tend to work along fairly narrow parameters. And games are systems, and it's a diverse ecology of systems. And I'm a believer that we can learn from games and how they engage and how they differentiate, and then graft or take some of those components and graft them into education systems in order to make them better. I would call the low-hanging fruit there, the gamification of education, but that's often associated with, an apparatus of rewards and points and levels, which is absolutely functional and valuable because, from my own experience, it works quite well. But I'm also interested in the fundamentals of turning educational systems into games, fun games with a whole series of dynamics that we would find at the game level and not just at the reward level. So we're launching Goldbug Interactive as a new studio that I launched with my partner in Mexico City. She's been doing work. We both work for the United Nations and a whole series of NGOs independently of each other. And we've joined forces because I think we complement each other quite well. And our studio, in addition to creating, apps and multimedia and animations and games, we also look for opportunities to work with schools in order to have them think more deeply about how they can use game elements in order to improve the way that they deliver learning and they adapt to teaching.
Thanks, Paul. So you use this interesting term, of course, which is very relevant to our discussion about gamification. And of course, these days, many sectors are looking to gamify. Your supermarket wants to gamify your experience. Your newspaper supplier wants to gamify your experience. It's gaming is seen as a means to hook you on because it's going to engage you. You're going to get addicted. So I'll be the devil's advocate here, and so I'm sure that Jana, I didn't know, Jana, that you're 15 years old. That I didn't say that on your LinkedIn profile. That's all the more impressive. So I'm sure that all of us are doing a great job at making the games that we do make. But without the resources of like a AAA game studio, it is unlikely that we'll be able to match the kind of games that they make. So can this gamification in education be seen as a ploy by these gaming companies to move into the education market? Because I mean, once some large studio releases a game, I think the quality of that may well surpass the quality of the games that we have out, and it may just be another market. The game companies may just view education as another market for their products. So what is that a valid perspective?
I have a response if I could. So of course, there's always a desire for entering a market by large corporate. There's no getting around that at any element of education. And of course that, there's increasingly better and more sophisticated learning games, some of them which I have issue with the way that they monetize. They're free for schools, but then kids have to pay at home in order to have access. And I understand the market realities of having to make these games work. There's no judgment there. But what I will say is that one of my sort of fundamental approaches is to rethink how teachers create their teaching identities and to start believing in themselves, not just as dispensers of knowledge, but as designers of experiences. There's a few model schools, particularly the Quest to Learn school in New York City, where they've had teachers work together with game designers in order to design not necessarily even digital experiences, but real world experiences that have learned from digital models. And I myself have designed a number of large-scale learning games with very little to no software, but have been deeply immersive learning experience where my students have produced more and better work in differentiated ways simply from the lessons I've learned from RPGs and video games, and taking those lessons and creating learning environments. And that's with very little budget, certainly no collaboration with corporations. And so the way we think, I like to distinguish is you think of games as center and circumference. So games as center would mean using, for example, a game like Gone Home or Rome Total War II in a class to teach a subject. And you would use it much as a dynamic or interactive textbook, or the same way you would bring a film into a class, or a book or a comic, you bring a game in for whatever particular affordance it has. The other way, the circumference, is how do you reconfigure the system of learning using a whole series, a whole grab bag of tools, mechanics, and narrative. I'm a big fan of using narrative in order to create these kind of immersive experiences in games. And that really is ultimately only governed by imagination and not really necessarily something that requires a high budget. But in order to enact that on any degree of scale, I believe that teachers have to start rethinking their role and how to enact that role.
That's very well said, Paul. Especially, definitely at my university, we've been grappling with online education during the pandemic, and that was already a point of reflection for all of us. We had to rethink what do we mean by teaching, how to do assessments online. That was a big issue, and I think the time, because of the pandemic, maybe it's been a welcome development that the pandemic has forced people to rethink teaching, to think about what is the actual point and how can we still deliver the same experience, but online while still staying true to our fundamentals. So Jana, you are developing games for, I imagine your audience is around the same age as yourself. So how do you go about it? How do you ensure? I mean, so this age group is particularly known for having a low attention span, not being interested, not being interested in too many things that don't excite them. So how do you make sure that the games that you develop are indeed engaging and students will that not only do you deliver your learning outcomes, but you also keep students engaged?
Well, I usually we make games for younger audiences because kids, really young kids spend a lot of time on their screens. And honestly, whatever you do, it's really hard to stop this. So maybe you can improve it by making them learn instead of just sit on their tablets all day and just play useless things. So we usually target them at home. So like we make it engaging by adding a lot of colors. You know, kids like a lot of colors, and we make it relatable and add characters that you can love. And like we got a lot of amazing feedback from parents who told us that their kids started waking up earlier, which they never did, just to start playing our game. And that was pretty cool. And also, we have made some games for older audiences. Like we made a game called Car Girl Garage, where it teaches youth or any age. Honestly, it didn't really have a specific age area, but it teaches basic car maintenance. And we got feedback from older people. Like we got feedback from a woman who has lost her memories due to a head injury, and she was restoring some of the things she used to do to fix her car, the basic maintenance things from our game, and she really enjoys the experience.
Nice. That's really interesting, and I think so. You correctly point out that these educational games can be useful not only for kids, but as you mentioned, this older woman also ended up playing your game and benefiting from it. So Ollie, I'll come back to you, and again, it's something that Paul touched upon when we talked of games in education. We don't necessarily mean games. We don't necessarily mean digital games. This may very well be offline games. So what is your take on this, and can you tell us about your work at Education Alliance Finland?
Yeah, well, at the EAF, what we do is we evaluate the educational quality of different types of learning solutions, and a fair share of the solutions that we have evaluated are either gamified solutions or actual, I could say, learning games. What we see a lot of products. We see hundreds of products every year, mainly new products, and it's been interesting to see that there are more and more. Almost every learning application uses some elements of gamification just to help learners and the users of the application to reflect their own progression, understand, get the sense of progression, and see what they have done and how they have succeeded with the learning activities. And of course, there's a lot of talk about, when related to gamification, there's a lot of talk about intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, and if it's like you only do the activities because you're offered a carrot after you have accomplished an activity. But then again, the same question is relevant, just asking that if it's extrinsic motivation, if the teacher says that, hey, you need to do the exercise, it's similarly or even more extrinsic motivation there. Then when, if not thinking about the gamified learning experience, but thinking more like learning games, there are many great examples from this type of linear learning games where it's completely prefixed, maybe adaptive, but still prefixed learning journey that the learning game provides. And I suppose that one of the strengths with that, besides interactivity, one of the strengths with this kind of linear learning games is that it is, you can build, as a game designer, you can build a truly immersive and engaging learning experience that is very much replicable between different learners, and for the teacher it's easy to understand how the learners are progressing and what can you achieve if you play the game for 45 minutes and so on. And then there are these games where the educator is designing what content is presented through the game. So there are either this kind of for example, Jetpack Learning is one of the companies designing this kind of, they have designed a platform with different game mechanics, and then using those game mechanics, the educator can tailor the learning content there. I suppose quiz tools are more or less a bit the same. And then there are applications that are facilitating the game experience or the gameplay experience in a way that, for example, there's one company called Seppo.io that has a platform that teachers can use to design a game that works like Amazing Race, so that, or Pokemon Go, so that the kids or the students, whoever, it's for adults as well. So the students are moving from one place to another and doing different kind of activities and collecting credits or points, doing different types of activities, and then they can compete against each other and so on. So and of course offline games, board games, learning games, those have been used for ages. And I think that regardless if it's an online offline game, the core idea and the mechanics is pretty much the same. One quality criteria that we have for all of the solutions, not only educational games, is that whatever the learning activities are, those need to be connected with learning goals. So the learning goals always needs to be the baseline for the design of the learning activities. If the learning activity is something else than an activity that would make you think about the learning goals, make you think about the things that you need to learn about, then I don't think that the learning experience is actually gamified. Then the learning is there is game, and then there's the learning part, and I don't think that's really useful way of using games or gamification in learning.
Right. So when you're describing this game to me, it occurred to me that in fact, in a way, education has always been gamified, because the way we do education, we give out marks or grades. Whoever has the highest score, comes first, or they get the highest grade. So in a way, education has always been gamified. Maybe the gamification aspect was not as pronounced, not as amplified as now, and now we have the technology to further ramp up the gamification aspect. So Paul, I mean, since you teach at the University of Toronto, so you have the most direct experience with this. So do you feel that this is a good development? I mean, we talked about, so Jana, for example, deals with younger kids for whom it is already a problem, the time that they spend on screen. Definitely with my kids, I have trouble pulling them away from their screens. So is more and more gamification, is that a good development? Do we feel that gamification is going to distract from the actual learning goals, or do we see that as a positive development in the area of education?
That's a very loaded question, and I do have a fairly elaborate answer, and I don't know if we have time for the longer version of it. But fundamentally, there's a few things to think about. One is I make a distinction between screen time and the use of games. Obviously, there's a huge overlap between screen time and the use of game, but as Oli's mentioned, there are board games. There are software that manage classroom dynamics to alter those, where the kids are actually not in front of the screens really the whole time. They're doing things, maybe even out in nature, that they're rewarded for, part of a competition. It doesn't necessarily have to be screen time. So the problem is we're coming from this industrial system, which is uniformity and like the worst parts of education. I'm not saying it's all like that, but the worst part, that is, whether it's good or bad, it's fallen out of step with the participatory interactive culture that we live in, right? The factory model, the spectatorial model of media is completely different than the interactive model that youth are used to. The Gen Z youth are used to producing and interacting and engaging and being active, and that's just not the way that education is built in its current state. Games exemplify participatory culture. It's not an incidental thing. It's not like, okay, games are a new way to engage kids. Not at all. Games are actually the natural expression, I would say even the art form of the 21st century, because they bring together all previous art forms and anything, social media, VR, AR, AI, all of this converges in games. Games are like the grand opera of 21st century learning. And I think because we've trivialized them, they've had so much negative press that it's obscured our view of this dynamic as, to the point of this panel, predictive of the future, not necessarily in the state that they currently exist in, but certainly pushing into ideas of the metaverse and artificial intelligence and blockchains and all of these things that will all in some way inform education. So, and very succinctly, I do believe there are great benefits in using games and thinking more deeply about how games and education merge. And I think that relationship is only going to deepen over time. But there are also negatives, right? Data mining, how all these other sides of it that because we don't have a magic bullet. There's no point in our current reality where we're going to find a perfect solution that's going to make the world a perfect place. So to quote, my beloved Marshall McLuhan, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's what's happening, right? It's the inevitable course of things, and we have to contend with it and align our very obsolete school systems to the participatory, interactive reality that contextualizes our society in the current moment that's going to become even more pronounced over the course of time.
Right. Those are very good points about how the education system is getting obsolete. It relies on, or it carries forward some of the worst elements of the industrial age from when it originated. And indeed, games do offer a much different, much better, one could argue, dynamic to the students. Gianna, are there particular elements that you look for, that you try to incorporate in your games? So Paul just mentioned interaction, creation. You mentioned already that you try to make your characters colorful. What other aspects do you look for when you, or do you aim for when you develop games for your audience?
I guess likability and keeping it short and interesting, because focus span for everyone, and especially kids, is really short. And honestly, I have a really short focus span, so I can understand the vein. And school doesn't accommodate this at all. Like, you have to go to school and stay staring at the board and the teacher for 8 hours straight or less, and it's really, really annoying. So I guess also relatability should be a factor. Just keeping it simple and short is the main factor in this, so that the kid doesn't get bored, the kid doesn't go away, because if they don't find it interesting, they're certainly not going to stay. And honestly, I think metaverse will make a revolution. I forgot how to speak. Will make a revolution for the educational games industry, and for a lot of industries, but mainly the educational games industry, because they aim to have an educational factor in the metaverse. And metaverse is certainly more interesting than Facebook. It's really great. And I think the fact that having VR games was one of our goals, because you can interact with the things, actually see things like history. You're just studying about dead people. So imagine being able to see how they lived. That way you can actually learn more than just memorize things.
Thanks, Jana. Ollie, so do you or are you aware of, I mean, so obviously, as we said, some aspect of gamification has always been there, right from the very start, in the way you assign scores to students and they get marks on an exam. And then these exam marks will accumulate to a certain score at the end of the semester. And then there's GPA at the end of your 4 years. It's a stacked, round by round tournament. now with the increasing use of technology and all of this, there are very real concerns like data privacy, who owns that data, how is the data used, that all comes into play. Are you aware of, and this is all relatively new, and we know, as is the case with many technology, that regulation is kind of slow to catch up. That's playing out right now in many different areas of technology these days. So are you aware of efforts to regulate educational games, or imposing some kind of framework, whether this be external, maybe governments come and say that we want to control what you can do and what you cannot do, or this may be internal, as in developers come together and they say, maybe along with the teachers, they make up some guidelines for themselves that this is the code of conduct that we'll follow. Are you aware of any efforts in that direction?
Well, in a way, we have been doing that work as well, partly internationally, but maybe even more here in Finland. So this year, during the spring and summer, we wrote, out of a request from the Ministry of Education in Finland, we wrote quality criteria for digital learning environments. And that concerns every kind of digital learning environments, not only games. But sorry, there's some background noise. Maybe somebody needs to mute the microphone. Yeah, so that is something in that area that we have been doing. It seems to me that at the moment the governments are they have realized that there are so many different types of learning applications out there. The market is huge and it's very fragmented. And nowadays anybody can create a learning game and just offer it to any school in the world. So it is quite overwhelming for teachers to understand that, okay, if we look at the learning games market, what are some of the good games that I could use with my students? What are some maybe not so good that I should not use with my students? It all boils down to the educational value and pedagogy, and then the data privacy and safety aspects. So these seem to be the main areas. So it's the pedagogical quality, the effectiveness of the learning solutions and learning games, and then the safety and data privacy. Data privacy is very challenging in a way, because there are many kinds of rules and regulations, and according to law, you're allowed to use certain solutions or solutions with certain kind of data privacy compliancy. But then again, for example, in Finland only, the different schools and different municipalities, they interpret the laws differently. So you might have one solution that is accepted in Helsinki, and then you go to the city next to Helsinki and they say that no, this is it's not allowed to use this solution because of the GDPR issues, and that's a very complex thing. And I think that many edtech companies are struggling with that. Many schools are struggling with that, and unfortunately, this at the moment it seems that in very many cases it leads to a situation that schools and teachers are too afraid of using high quality solutions because they are not sure if those are GDPR compliant or not. So they go with the old way, and the ones who lose the most in this situation are, of course, the students. So rules and regulation, I think, definitely needed, because teachers need help to understand what are good solutions, what are safe solutions, and also because the companies and developers of learning games need ways to communicate that, yes, my solution aligns with these certain rules and regulations. This is a safe application. You can use it.
If I could build on that fascinating discussion, is that in every sector, technology is outpacing policy. Right? Policy is always trying to catch up with technology on every level, and falling sadly behind. And I would think in education, because it hasn't been raised as a major issue, I think most parts of the world are not keeping up. But in addition to the problem of privacy and data privacy, there's another side to this, to kind of a two-headed beast. One is how you interpret the data. the richer data we get, doesn't tell a story. You tell a story about the data. And then so the types of stories we tell about the data could label students, could do all kinds of manipulations of information to categorize that data in a way which may not be beneficial, it could be harmful. And that's a conversation we have to start having, right? And this leads to the same kind of interpretive issues we have in any kind of a political forum where we have different and conflicting points of view and ideologies. And then the question of ideology is a fundamental one in games that is not really being addressed. There are many games that seem on the surface to be fun and relevant. For example, I grew up playing a board game called Risk, right? Where it's a board of the world and you have pieces and you move them around and you conquer other countries. And that seems like a lot of fun and maybe a nice fit with a history class. But there are implicit values in a game about territorial conquest and colonialism fundamentally, right? And we play these games mindlessly, like, you know, Civilization is an amazing history game, or any of these games, but we have to understand that there's systems of persuasion at the deepest levels of these games, and they're not even necessarily something that somebody has intentionally done with nefarious purposes. They're just reinscribing ideological beliefs about capitalism, about conquest, about territory. And those on a fundamental level may be reinforcing ideas that we really have to change. So I think that games have the power, by the way that they're built and designed, to offer a different vision of the world. And I'm not sure we're doing a very good job of that right now.
Thanks, Paul. That's quite enlightening. I'd never actually. I've played Risk too, of course. I never thought of it that way, but indeed, now that you pointed out, I see what you're saying. Jana, I'm interested. So I imagine you're also going to school, and then are there times when you like go up to your teacher and say, maybe you know you could have done this way, or do you offer to make a game? Do you offer to your teacher to make a game for them? You tell them, hey, maybe you could have done quadratic equations this way. Let me make a game for you to teach quadratic equations.
No, schools here aren't too great, and especially public schools. I go to a public school, and they always complain. Before coronavirus, no one was accepting to the idea of video games here for teaching. So like they were like, what if tablets disappear? You haven't taught kids how to live without their tablets. They won't know how to survive or write. Honestly, if tablets disappear, probably the end of the world, or we have something better. So now they are more accepting, but public schools always use the ministry as an excuse. So that like the ministry won't approve without even asking, without even thinking about doing anything. So my school is not an option. They're not very supportive of the idea, or not even very supportive of the idea of me making games anyway. But we tried with private schools. They had a better response, and we did try to get it in some classes, and the feedback was really positive. Kids loved the game. So yeah, it depends on what you're targeting. So private schools are like more open to this thing. Yeah.
So how are you measuring the effect of your game? I mean, it is one thing when parents say that their kids are waking up early. That is, of course, great feedback. But are you getting in touch with the teachers and they tell you that, yes, I notice X% change in the outcomes in my class? Is there any measurement going on along those lines?
Yeah, we do ask for the feedback of the kids and the feedback of the teachers themselves, and we usually do get positive feedback. We sometimes get criticism, but in a good way. So like to build on our products more.
Okay, nice. So Ollie, in your position, I believe, so you come across a lot of games, and do you feel that there are any peculiarities to educational games that don't hold, or that are in addition to the considerations to designing a regular game? So of course, any a non-educational game, let's say, which does not focus on any learning outcomes, is somewhat unrestricted as compared to an educational game, which is tied to certain learning outcomes. So if would you have any tips for Jana, for example, the next time she's developing a game, what components, what ingredients make for a good educational game?
Yeah, well, I suppose that with the design of any kinds of educational technology solution, one good starting point is to think first about the what is the need and what is the educational problem that you're solving. So if the educational problem is that the learning engagement is low when students are practicing multiplication table. So if you've addressed that problem and then after that you start listing that what are the learning objectives regarding or connected to that addressed problem. So naturally in this example case, it would be the multiplication table, and maybe for different numbers. And then you have the certain learning goals defined, and then you can start coming up with mechanics that, okay, what would be some well-functioning mechanics to practice multiplication table. And there are some great case examples. It really depends on the learning goals, that what kind of learning activities can be pedagogically best justified to be provided for the learners. But for example, this type of a learning objective that requires drilling and repetition, like multiplication table, or for example, learning foreign language words, this kind of repetitive and drilling type of exercise can work really well, just to build the routine and enforce learning. And naturally, this kind of repetitive activity is many times done through a game-like experience or through gaming experience. And there are some good examples in this as well, that, for example, and research evidence as well of the effectiveness. So there's, for example, this company called Edutainment. It's coming from one of the big universities in Finland, and they have math learning platform, gamified math or game-like math learning platform. And the simple idea is that through the use of the gamification or building those math activities as games, they can increase the number of done activities by the students. And with the increased number of done activities, the routine of equations or doing math activities is improved. And because the routine is improved, the math skills are better than comparison group that was not given the same math platform. And they have tons of research evidence of this, and it's very, in a way, in this case, it's very simple. They just, through the games, they get the students to do more exercises, and that's it. And it works with several different classes, regardless of the age, regardless of the students' interest areas or education level or whatever. But it always works. And this is one good sort of example. I think that the game mechanics work really well with this kind of activities where you practice something that you have right or wrong answer, and then it maybe it becomes a bit more complex when you need to start if your learning objective is to help the learners to understand some phenomenons, for example, to be able to explain those phenomenon. And then how to build a game activity around that. Of course, it is possible, and maybe it just takes more time for the learner to play the game, to build that understanding and be able to explain that. But still, it becomes more complex. Even in mathematics, you see that the simpler concepts in mathematics you can gamify and build games around those. But the more complex it goes, it is harder to give the feedback for the learner through the gaming experience, that why your answer was wrong, why your answer was right, or if it was wrong, what to do differently next time in order to get it right. So those are mainly the issues, but drilling activities works really well.
Thanks, Ollie. So Paul, you are an educator at University of Toronto, and you're also a game designer. So when we started the conversation, you talked about how education is a system and games are a system, and then how we can map one system to the other, or at least try to build this mapping. So how has designing games informed your teaching? Do you feel that there are elements from game design that have caused you to think differently about your teaching, or maybe you approach your classes or assessments differently? Has that had an influence on your teaching?
100%. Some of the more elaborate sort of learning experience that I've designed two very big ones. One is called Blind Protocol, which is a cyber warfare simulator that I designed with a teacher in the United States, where we had our objective was to learn about, our students to learn about privacy and surveillance issues as part of a digital literacy unit. And we designed a month-long immersive experience where an artificial intelligence has penetrated the servers of the school and is manipulating events in order to pit them against each other. And neither school knew the other one was involved until halfway through the game. It's revealed that they've been having this parallel experience, and now the final portion of the game is to uncover the identity and the location of your opponents somewhere in the world, which was the school in the US and a school in Canada. And it involved narrative videos and game mechanics and challenges and treasure hunts and artifact production and an in-game economy. And it took us, probably my colleague and I, about a year and a half to develop the game, to really think about the mechanics. And we would spend hours on phone calls on our weekends and mapping it out and designing different artifacts and catalogs and all kinds of things. And inevitably, when you undertake that process of design, it changes your brain. The neurons start firing differently. And when you enact it, when it's not just a theory, but you see it in practice, you see what succeeds and what doesn't, and then you refine it. But what's amazing is the two big ones that I've built. Another one is based on Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where I turn a school into an asylum. Both of them have absolutely transformed the way that I think about education. And both of them made me hopeful, where I felt like this is the future of education. There's no doubt in my mind. I see what this can do. I can see that all these students have had rich and diverse experiences. There's been a degree of freedom that you don't typically encounter in schools. And to Oli's point, I've managed to meet and exceed learning objectives in any one of these situations, where it's not just sort of a free-for-all where I loosely meet the learning objectives. In some ways, we exceed the learning objectives. So it's all about design. So to that point, at my class, one of my classes at the University of Toronto is a games and learning class for pre-service teachers that are becoming, and I have to say, the class has proven transformative. Many young teachers change their view on their practice after they take the class. And a fundamental building block of how I approach the classes, I start the first part introducing them to why games and learning. Like, why do you think about these? Then giving them all kinds of different examples and models. And their final project is for them to design a learning game. And you would think that they're going to be doing, sort of Jeopardy or versions of Monopoly with slightly different or altered things. They design magnificent games, and many of them don't consider themselves designers at the beginning of the course, because I take a survey and I think, do you consider yourself as a designer? No, maybe a little bit. And by the end, when they design these games that are really phenomenal, the lesson is, yes, you can design learning games for your students, and certainly the one that you design for this class can be used in your practice. But now that you have a new superpower, now that you realize you can bring all these different elements together, how can you change the way that you're running your classes? How can you make school more engaging for your students? And it's a very empowering thing. And many of these young teachers grew up with games, and they don't connect all these hours wasted playing with their teaching practice. And all of a sudden, when that very thin membrane is broken and they realize all those things that I've spent time learning through games, I can now think about teaching in that way. It proves to be a fairly transformative experience for many of them.
That's excellent, Paul. I wish I could take your class. So I'm being told that the next panelists are here. So we'll end with Jana. Do you have any tips? I find it very impressive that at 15 already you're making games. Do you have any tips for any young listeners that you may have who may be thinking themselves about going into game development, who may be thinking of how big
I'm really sorry, but we're running out of time. Is it possible that this message can be shared in chat, maybe?
Okay, sure.
Don't
Jana,
hate me.
I'll ask you to share in chat any tips you may have for budding game developers. And with that, I'll thank Samar for having us, and thank you, Jana, Oli, Paul. It was nice talking to you.
And thank you for doing a magnificent job as a moderator.